Back to the second in a series of collaborative conversations sponsored by the College of Leadership and Public Service at Lipscomb University. Tonight, I'm Steve Joyner. I'm the Dean of the college. I'm really excited about tonight because it's an area that probably I know the least about. I tell Dot and Emily all the time, I'm constantly educated in the field of sustainable practice by my faculty. And I think I got feedback from the mics there. I am excited about the conversations of the impact of immigration and food systems. I'm going to do this. It's all right, I'll do this. And the impact of immigration and food systems is part of our conversation. This is one of four conversations about immigration and society we live in. And the other two will one follow in November. Put us some of the dates off the top of your head. November 10 to December 8. Led by civic leadership and conflict management. I know there's no conflict attached to sustainable practice, but we'll try to find it. So I want to welcome you tonight. The founding director of the Sustainable Practice, Todd Now, is going to quick hello. Do you want to say anything, Todd, before we turn it over to you? Welcome. That was very quick. So we're happy to turn it over to Emily Jones, the academic director of the area, and look forward to tonight. Thank you.
Thank you for coming, and I'm excited for this evening. We've been planning this eagerly since last year when we decided that immigration would be our topic. I'm going to introduce myself. My name is Emily Stutzman-Jones. I'm the academic director of the Institute for Sustainable Practice. We have several students in the room who are my students, either as undergraduates or as graduates in our graduate program. The conversation continues with collaborative conversations sponsored Human Docs movie night on food justice in the immigration, or food justice around immigration and laborers on December 4th. So there's a documentary screening of a documentary called The Hand That Feeds. That'll be the evening of December 4th, so keep that on your calendars as well. All right. So I'm glad to welcome you tonight to the October meeting of the Collaborative Conversations. Upton Sinclair's 1904 novel, The Jungle, revealed the public health risk as well as the unsanitary practices impacting immigrants in Chicago's meatpacking district. He examined the horrifying physical working conditions and communicated them to the public through art, through the novel. He increased public awareness of food safety concerns and is commonly recognized as having an important impact on the passage of the Pure Food and Drug and Meat Inspection Act of 1906. And he later commented about the effect of his novel. And he said, "I aimed at the public's heart and by accident hit its stomach." And what he meant by that was the impact of his novel was felt disproportionately by people around food safety, and there was a less concern around the immigrant experience in the food system, and he saw that as a problem. So I'm glad to say that this current agri-food system is concerned with the sustainability and livelihoods of workers throughout the food system. And there's a growing recognition that safe, healthy workers in safe, healthy working environments using safe, healthy ecological practices are always necessary for the production of safe and healthy foods. And I'm proud of that. To paraphrase the triple bottom line, or the three pillars of sustainability, a solution is sustainable if it is socially equitable, economically just, and environmentally sound. And so tonight we'll be hearing from panel members who find their vocation and their calling and work into the curating or cultivating of conditions where safe, healthy workers can flourish resulting in a safe and healthy harvest. So my educational background is in rural sociology, and that's a discipline that considers the eco-social systems, including the agri-food system. One of my research assignments as a rural sociologist was around investigating what motivated fruit and vegetable growers in Florida to voluntarily adopt a technology that was effectively probiotics for plants. Humans take probiotics to allow the healthy bacteria or the healthy microflora to flourish, and there's a technology around plant growth promoting rhizobacteria that did the same thing for plants. So these were conventional farmers, they weren't organic farmers, and they were voluntarily adopting an agricultural technology that was environmentally beneficial, economically accessible, and socially acceptable. And one finding that surprised my research team and surprised everybody involved was the farmers' desire to find a safe way to do what they love, a safe way to grow good, healthy food in a way that reduced their exposure to health risks. Everybody come on in. There's plenty of seats. There are seats kind of both sides. So these farmers were interested in finding ways to avoid the health concerns that production agriculture necessarily offers, and many told vivid, very personal stories of some of the risks that were associated with their conventional practices, including chemical burns and situations where they truly felt their lives were in danger. I encourage everybody to come and sit down in a chair if you would like. Okay. There are plenty in the front, in the corners. You can make it around to the sides, however you want to do that. So I'm gonna read a quote from one of my growers. And fruit and vegetable growers in Florida call themselves growers, not farmers, but you might know them as farmers. So he said, "I think there's a lot of growers who already don't use methyl bromide, a soil fumigant, and for good reason." And he said, "I'm a little bit prejudiced because I got burned pretty bad. I was putting out methyl bromide with a piece of equipment and I had gloves on, but I didn't realize it. It was leaking. And of course it permeated that glove and it was putting that methyl bromide right into me. And my hand swelled up and I had a blister 2 inches high. They had to cut off my ring because my finger was swollen up, and they had to cut my ring quickly because it was about to take my finger off. I sure got a dose of it, the methyl bromide. My pulse rate was up to 140, and it was not good. Anything we can do to replace things like that and get more to natural solutions, the better off we'll be." So these farmers that I was talking to, they're the landowners. They're professionals. They're in positions of social power, economic power, and professional power. And they had the language and the network and the education to make choices that impacted their well-being and the well-being of the people that they employed and that they were a part of. So tonight we are considering the risks that immigrants in the food system with far fewer resources than those farmers that I spoke with, and they're to frame their situations in a way that exposes them to fewer risks than those farmers were. And we have the opportunity to consider this conversation, the opportunity to reframe and look for opportunities to reframe a food system toward equality and wholeness. So throughout these presentations, and our Panama in the Bush will be coming up in just a minute, be mindful of some of these questions. So what is the nature of the work that immigrants perform in our food system? What are some of the particular risks that immigrants are exposed to in the food system? Who may hold ethical responsibility for maintaining and sustaining a safe and healthy food system? And what leverage points may exist to transform the food system around minimizing risk to immigrant workers? And my students in particular should that language of leverage points. Identifying leverage points is one of the hallmarks of our sustainability curriculum. So with that, I would like to invite my panel to the front, and I'll introduce them once they arrive. Looks like Lee might still be coming. And I'm going to figure out, it's hard to talk to the back of people's heads. Well, I want them to see your faces. So could I get somebody to help me scoot this? IT people, am I allowed to scoot this? Okay, I've got a professional, but thank you for your your quick offers. To the side so I can see them. Okay. Perfect. What's your name? Corey. Thank you very much, Corey. All right, so I've invited these panelists today, and I'm going to allow them to introduce themselves. I'm going to say quickly who they are and how I met them. Jonathan McCrae is a farmer and agroforester and an ecologist in Virginia, and he and I were colleagues as undergrads and have kind of coalesced around the agroforestry topic in later in life. And Tristan Call is here as well, and I met Tristan on campus. Was anybody present for the, is this working now? Yes, okay. Is for the food chains documentary a few months back? You'll recognize Tristan as I saw Kristen Schatzer raise her hand, that's why I said Kristen. You'll recognize Tristan as a panelist in that presentation as well. And this is Lee Bonner. A good friend put me in touch with Lee, and she is a job placement officer with Nations Ministry, a local refugee resettlement agency. So the format of tonight, we're going to have time for each of these presenters to give a short explanation of themselves and their work and their engagement around food and agriculture and immigrants in the food sector. And then I'm excited to kind of participate in a conversation with them and listen to some of their reactions and questions for each other. So let's start it off with Jonathan.
Awesome. My name is Jonathan McRae, and I farm and do community peace building in the Shenandoah Valley in Virginia. I live in a city called Harrisonburg of about 50,000 people. Strong agricultural history in the Shenandoah Valley, and I work with a small nonprofit and organizing collective called Vine and Fig that's associated with an organization called New Community Project. And we have multiple spheres of influence. We are an education and demonstration site for sustainable and just living, focusing on food justice and on ecological design. And then we're also a supportive home of hospitality for friends who have experienced homelessness and addiction and difficult life circumstances. And then a project incubator to help hatch similar ideas and actions for justice and regeneration in our community and in the city and beyond. And so working with schools and churches and other organizations to look at the intersections of ecology and social justice and community building. And I have worked as a restorative justice facilitator and as a market garden coordinator for our work there. And have been living on a farm for several years previous to that. And we live in, our project is located in a really interesting urban neighborhood with lots of low-income white families and a rising Hispanic immigrant population that is coming often to Harrisonburg because of the large poultry industry and the jobs that are available through that. And so many of our neighbors have been working in those processing plants in the city just down the street from where all of our gardens and fruit trees and ponds are located. And we have several friends, undocumented Hispanic women that work with us who we have been funding through a food justice grant that we received that is running out very quickly and we need to figure out what we're going to do next. We operate on a shoestring budget of $20,000 a year that is funding everybody who works there and paying the mortgage on the houses that we get through donations and through our market garden. And this is one of the big tensions that we have is we have a very broken and a very unjust food system. Partly because the food is so cheap, which is unjust because it doesn't adequately reflect what it takes to grow the food in terms of adequate pay for labor, in terms of the impacts that it has on ecosystems, on the health of soil and water. But cheap or expensive food is also unjust because people are not paid living wages or not having their needs met. And so if we try to price our food too high as local organic produce, many of our neighbors and friends can't afford it. If we price it so low, we don't make any money and can't sustain our project. And so this is a major conundrum that is a systemic issue. We can't just be solving it at our small organizational level. So we are trying as much as possible to organize around food justice, this idea that the communities themselves should be growing and eating and selling food that is fresh and nutritious and culturally appropriate and is locally grown, that cares for the well-being of the land and the workers and the animals. And learning very much from our friends who are coming from farming communities around the world who have been displaced through economic policies of the United States and are now coming here to grow our food and being paid nothing for it, and are some of the hungriest people in this country. We depend in this country, our food system, since the very beginning in the United States, on imported labor, be that indentured servitude or chattel slavery or migrant farm workers and sharecroppers. Many of them were Asian at a certain point in this country, and now largely Hispanic. And this is a new form of slave labor that we are depending on to grow our food, because those of us who come from power and privilege as white people, are not connected to the processes and the systems that sustain our lives, and we force other people to do it for us. And this is an unsustainable process. And so our work is attempting to ally ourselves and become accomplices with people working for justice and sustainability.
Thank you. Tristan?
We'll see if the microphone's necessary. I'll try to speak into it, though. Thanks so much for inviting me to be a part of this, and it's a pleasure hearing what Jonathan and others are working on in Harrisonburg. My name is Tristan Call, and I'm coming as a representative of Nashville Fair Food, which is an organization that I'm really excited to say a number of the people in the audience here have been involved with over its 4 or 5 years of existence. And what Nashville Fair Food does primarily is it's seeking to find a way for people in Nashville who primarily understand themselves as consumers of food, but who are connected in many, many ways to organizations that have a say in how the food that they consume might, at its point of origin, be produced, how they can work in solidarity and in direct connection with the producers of that food to improve the conditions of labor and life of those who bring us food. It's a roundabout way of saying we support farm workers who are directing their own struggle for justice. And in Nashville, what we've been doing for about 5 years, though it goes further back, some of these relationships, but Nashville Fair Food was founded about 5 years ago. What we've primarily worked on is a campaign with the Coalition of Immokalee Workers. Raise your hand if you've ever heard of them, so I get a sense of how much explanation is that. So I'll explain a little bit. The Coalition of Immokalee Workers is in a little town, about 30,000 people in southwest Florida, in Collier County, Lee County. If you've ever been or familiar with Fort Myers, Florida, or Naples, Florida, 2 of the wealthiest zip codes in the country. If you go about 25 miles east of there, you end up in the orange groves and in the tomato fields. In the tomato fields where the majority of the fresh tomatoes east of the Mississippi are grown for us during the winter months. Those tomatoes are going to start arriving here in Nashville probably in November. And that's what's going to feed any fresh tomatoes that we eat. Well, not any, about 70-80% of the fresh tomatoes that we eat here up through about May or June, depending on when the hothouse tomatoes start coming in. And so those farm workers in Florida have been laboring under some of the most challenging conditions in U.S. agriculture. Sometimes we have a longer presentation where we go through all the details, but I'll say what some of the things that they face there are. You have to pick about 2.5 tons of tomatoes a day in order to make a minimum wage. You're paid about 50 cents a bucket for a 32-pound bucket, so we do the math, and it comes to 2.5 tons a day. That's often getting up about 4:30 in the morning in order to get on a bus, which will then take you to the fields and have you sit for about 3 hours before you begin to pick and before you begin to earn, because you're paid by the bucket, not by the hour. About 1,300 of those workers in the last 14 years have been freed from forced labor. These have been 7 Department of Justice prosecuted slavery ring cases in South Florida. So it was called by the Department of Justice ground zero for modern day slavery in the United States. 1,300 workers in 7 different cases who had been locked up at night, held under armed guard, chained up in U-Haul trucks, had been paid either with company scrip or had their wages withheld for weeks or months or years at a time. And in some of the numbers that have come out from the Department of Justice, and especially an especially traumatic experience for a lot of the women working in the fields, of whom about 70% have experienced sexual assault in their time working in the fields. So what the Coalition of Immokalee Workers has done, really since the mid-90s when it began, was to say, nobody's coming to save the farm workers. It's not going to be, it hasn't happened in the 1700s or the 1800s or the 1900s. It's not going to happen in the 21st century either. The farm workers are going to have to decide and to ask for support for their own decisions and the change that they want to make for themselves. And so what the Coalition of Immokalee Workers has done is to design and analyze their own campaigns of where responsibility lies for those sorts of trauma and those kinds of injustice that they experience on a daily basis. And that's a tricky thing for them to do. Because when you experience that kind of thing, maybe directly from a crew leader who hired you on, it's difficult to imagine that there's someone else up the chain that you might blame for that. You're gonna, as any human would, put some immediate responsibility on the crew leader who just struck you, or on maybe the farmer who you saw walking through the fields and you saw sort of turn the other way when they saw what was going on. But it's rare to find a group that through this long process of analysis among farm workers decided where the responsibility is the people that actually have the power to change the food system. And so they went up the chain and have, as a number of people in the room have experienced, have had campaigns nationwide to bring in the biggest buyers of tomatoes, to take responsibility for those conditions, to pay an extra penny a pound for tomatoes, which goes straight to the worker and raises wages about 70%, to have a labor code of conduct with zero tolerance for slavery and sexual assault, and most importantly, to actually make it happen, farm workers at the table to monitor and to actually negotiate those agreements for themselves. So that's what they do. What Nashville Fair Food does is support those campaigns and that organizing process and that alliance building process where we are, which is in Nashville. And I'm looking forward to being able to share and engage with the projects that others are working on.
Thank you, Tristan. Lee, tell us about what you do.
Sure. I work with Nations Ministry Center. We are a very small nonprofit in Nashville, and we're actually not a resettlement agency, which is I think the beauty of our organization in some ways is that resettlement agencies are agencies that are funded primarily by the federal government to welcome refugees in their first 8 months to 5 years in the U.S. From arrival to 8 months is the most heavy work that they do, but after the first 8 months, there are still some other funded programs from the Office for Refugee Resettlement, which is under Health and Human Services in D.C. And that money from ORR, the Office for Refugee Resettlement, gets funneled down through state refugee agencies that then give that granted money to the organizations that are charged with helping refugees. And our organization, being just a regular 501(c), we started out as a project of 9, several, I think it was 9 Presbyterian churches in Nashville that had a concern for refugees who maybe weren't getting all of the services that they should have received from resettlement agencies. And that's not to fault resettlement agencies, but that's to say that they were probably stretched very thin based on the amount of funding that they were awarded. And so the churches, the people in these churches kind of stepped in and started helping refugees that weren't receiving all of the services that they needed for their families. And eventually that evolved into Nations Ministry Center, which is still very small, but when I started working there in 2012, there was a staff of 3. It was the director and 2 part-time workers, one for the after-school program and then a part-time social worker. And they had just gotten this new grant for my position, not for me, but for the position that I occupy, from the Tennessee Office of Refugees for what they call targeted assistance, which is employment assistance for refugees after 8 months in the United States. And I started out part-time, but quickly my job evolved into a full-time job, and there was some private funding secured to fill those 40 hours plus during the week for me to get this program going at Nations Ministry Center. And that was actually the first federal grant that Nations received, as far as I know. So we're pretty small. We work with a much smaller caseload than a resettlement agency would. And the privilege of having a lot of private funding from congregations and individuals and family foundations is that we can take a little bit more liberty with what we're able to do in terms of the time frame that the refugees have been in the United States. We can work with more in terms of that. We can also be more flexible in what we set as our goals and things like that. But my position is 90% funded under the state funding and 10% funded for whatever else. So in some ways it's a little bit more difficult. I don't know a whole lot about the particularities of resettlement, so I'm not an expert in that area, but I do know a few broad things because I have to do a lot of work with people who work at resettlement agencies to communicate about different clients and where they're enrolled and all that kind of thing. I do know that in the first 8 months, refugees have to get jobs very rapidly because they come to the United States in debt. They not only don't have any possessions because the countries that they fled from were war situations, and then they went to a second country where they were poor and where they were either in a refugee camp or in housing where or not in housing. Some people slept under trees until they were processed by the UN High Commissioner for Refugees to be resettled permanently in a third country. So not only are they coming from this situation, but they're coming to the United States with the debt to the International Organization of Migration, IOM, of paying back the plane ticket that brought them to the United States. And that's for their whole family. So if you're coming from Burundi and you have a farming family with 2 adults and 7 children, you've got to pay back plane tickets for 9 people from East Africa to Nashville, for example. So they have to get employment very, very quickly. And from my perspective, and we were talking a little bit about this at dinner, I can sit from my high and mighty tower and say, these resettlement agencies are horrible for throwing these refugees into Tyson, for just dumping them off there, like literally pulling the van up at the door and letting them go. But on the flip side of that, if a refugee does not get employment pretty quickly after he or she arrives, that can mean lots of danger when those 8 months end, and they're not getting their cash assistance, they're not getting the hand-holding that they were getting through the refugee resettlement agency. So one thing that happens in those first 8 months is that refugees end up in jobs like working at Tyson, which in Shelbyville, which is about an hour and a half south of here, there are hundreds of current refugees, former refugees who have now have become naturalized citizens, cutting our meat for us. They're cutting it, they're packaging it, they're putting it in the shipping area, they're forklifting it out to the trucks, and some of them are driving the trucks and bringing it to us. And Tyson Chicken is in Shelbyville, and then in Goodlettsville, Tennessee, there is a beef and pork facility. And they're doing the same thing up there, including slaughtering animals. To my knowledge, they don't actually slaughter the chickens in Shelbyville. Y'all can correct me if I'm wrong, but in Goodlettsville, they actually kill the cows and the pigs there. So some of them are actually slaughtering this meat for us. And in other places, such as Fresh Point, it's a tomato packaging facility in Nashville, which is probably where some of these Immokalee tomatoes end up. There are refugees packaging and weighing tomatoes that have arrived here to be shipped out to fast food chains and other things like that. And then there are other refugees who have jobs at Whole Foods. So some refugees who have a little bit more English and have a few more skills can start out at Whole Foods. And obviously it is what you might think it is. They do get paid a higher wage. They do get treated a lot better. The conditions are a lot better. The skills that they learn are more marketable if they want to go to a different job later on. And then by the time they get to me, they have passed their 8 months. Usually they're somewhere between 1 and 5 years in the U.S. And sometimes people want to go to Tyson, but it's very rare. Most of the time people are wanting to get out of a place like Tyson and go on to a place like Nissan, where they're making cars, learning manufacturing skills, working for a company that will give them paid vacation after a year. Not to say that Tyson doesn't do that, because they do. But they're making just as much as they did at Tyson or more, and they're learning a marketable skill instead of just cutting the same chicken tender all day long. So by the time they get to me, they've reached a point where they probably have learned a lot more English. They have figured out that there are other opportunities out there. And then another thing that happens is that jobs become popular among certain ethnic groups. So it would just be if anybody in this room heard from somebody that, hey, they're hiring over at this company and you have these skills, why don't you come over and work alongside of me and get out of whatever you're doing now. And so things like that happen, word of mouth spreads, and then of course they would want to work with people from their own background because it's helpful for figuring out cultural things, for a little bit of explanation in their own language if they need an explanation of something that happened at work a particular day or something like that. So there are lots of good reasons why they would want to leave a job at Tyson, but there are also a lot of good reasons why they would want to stay. And I was talking to my assistant today, who is from the Zomi ethnic community from Burma, and her husband has been working at Tyson for, I think, 6 or 7 years. And he has stayed there because it's stable. He doesn't have to learn anything new. And I know as a youngish adult, that when you start to get into your 30s, you don't want to start something new as much as you did before, because it's harder to learn new things. It takes longer to learn new things. It takes longer to get used to the people that you're working with. And so it becomes more of a burden to quit a job after you're a certain age or after you've been somewhere for a longer period of time. So the sense of security that he feels there with his coworkers, with his supervisors, with the job that he's doing, keeps him there. He doesn't have to learn anything new. He's got people there who can translate if he doesn't understand what's going on. And then there are also opportunities to move to other departments. It's not necessarily a moving up, but frequently Tyson posts new positions in different departments. And so if he has a problem with his carpool, if somebody in his carpool quits, if his driver quits and he needs to change his shift, he can move over to a different position and still make the same amount of money. And those shifts are based on seniority a lot of times. So there are some advantages to staying there for a longer period of time. You can kind of choose the work that you do and things like that. So on the one hand, you've got this horrible, what I would say is a horrible working condition. And on the other hand, you have a lot of aspects of the job that are attractive to people who need stability, who don't come from a place of stability. And so although I am a huge advocate of moving them out of that kind of work, and I have the privilege of looking up from my position, bird's eye view, and saying, well, look, you're a really smart person. You've learned more English. Why don't we put you in something that can gain you more skills so that your family can be supported in the long run, so that your children can learn that it's okay to embrace change, that it's okay to say, I don't like this, I'm going to something else, and things like that. So on the one hand, I can come up from my position of knowing these things and tell my clients, hey, it's time to move on to something else, but they're in the weeds. So it's really hard when you're in the weeds to see the bigger picture, if that makes any sense. So that's kind of the perspective that I'm coming from, helping refugees find sustainable employment.
Thank you, Lee. All right. Thank you, for sharing that. But something that I want to ask all of my presenters, and we'll start with Lee. I chop chicken at my house, and it's not, it may be a repetitive task, and it may be a low skills task, but decent work, earning a decent wage is respectable. What in your experiences with the refugees you've worked with, what makes that work less desirable what makes that work risky? What are some of the particular challenges that refugees face or anyone faces in that particular work? Can you speak to those?
Sure. I've heard a lot of stories, and a lot of my data is anecdotal. It's not, I'm sitting in front of a computer and saying 80% of my clients say X and 20% of my clients say B. Over the 3 years that I've worked at Nations Ministry, the people who come to me and want to work new jobs have said a variety of different things about why they want to quit Tyson, for example. One of the reasons that I have heard the most is that it's cold. The work environment is a refrigerator. They're working in a place with raw meat. It has to be refrigerated. And part of working in a cold environment is that with repetitive motions is that you're going to inevitably end up with carpal tunnel syndrome at some point in your career there. So if you're cutting chicken tenders all day long and it's 30 degrees, even though you're bundled up, this repetitive stress injury is bound to happen at some point. And so I was actually talking to one of my clients this morning who I've known for about a year now, and I did not know that she had worked at Tyson before, actually, because she was in Texas before she moved to Tennessee, and she worked at a Tyson beef factory in Texas. And she showed me a selfie that she took in the locker room of all of the stuff that she had to put on to stay warm. And so she had her hard hat on, and she had her earplugs strapped on her shoulder. She said, I put those in when I go in the fridge. But she had all the layers on, like scarves and sweaters and coats and stuff. And then she said, I put a lab coat on over all of that. And then she said, and these are my gloves. And she said, at one point, after working there for about a year and a half, she told her supervisor that her hands were hurting really badly. And he told her to put on more gloves. And so he gave her 2 more gloves for her left hand and 1 more glove for her right hand. And she said it got better, but then her injury got worse. So the cold got better, and she was able to continue doing her job, but when she got home, she could continue to feel it in her wrists and her arms and her hands. And that's just one of many examples that I've heard about carpal tunnel. And I've also heard people say things about digestive problems and respiratory issues. They've cited those reasons for quitting Tyson as well.
Can you speak to some of the demands, particularly in a slaughter facility, and why that might be particularly troublesome to somebody coming in as a refugee?
There was one man that I spoke to a couple of years ago, and this sticks in my mind as probably the hardest thing for me to imagine that I've heard a refugee talk about as an experience in the United States. This man had come from a refugee situation, and I don't know his story. I often don't ask people's stories because I don't want them to relive what they have already tried to get through. But refugee situations are obviously very traumatic. Even if you didn't actually flee the war, even if you were born in a refugee camp, you're still dealing with a great deal of depravity. Your food falls off a UN truck, you get a bag of beans and a bag of rice every day, and then you go find your own water, your own firewood, and your own cooking materials. So after you've lived that whole life, that can be traumatic as well, even if you didn't flee the war. So even if you didn't see people get shot or anything like that, you've still lived some trauma. And this man had probably not fled the war. He'd probably been in a refugee camp. But his job at the beef Tyson in Goodlettsville was to shoot the pigs. And USDA requirements, I don't know all of them, but he told me about this specific requirement that if you shoot a pig in the prescribed spot and it does not die, you cannot have mercy on that animal and make another shot to kill it and take it out of its misery. You have to let it die from that one shot. And so he explained this to me, and he said, this is why I don't want to work at Tyson. I was like, really? Can't imagine. So it hurt my heart and my soul to hear this man who has escaped whatever he has escaped, only to come to the United States and to be welcomed as somebody who gets to shoot the pigs for however much he was making an hour, and it could have been $12 an hour for all I know. After you've been at Tyson for a while, some people make $13. But he's shooting the pigs. And that just really troubled me a lot.
And to be clear, any animal food product depends on the slaughter of an animal in we work towards ethical slaughter mechanisms. What I want to emphasize here is the disproportionate impact of the slaughtering process on people who are the most vulnerable economically and culturally. I personally have participated in slaughtering meat that I have consumed, and I will tell you that experience changes how I eat that meal, how I eat that animal. There's a spiritual component, I believe. So this is not to say that slaughtering pigs is wrong. I just personally think that it is important to recognize that some individuals bear the brunt of the spiritual and physical impact of this aspect of the food system that we all participate in differently. So Tristan and John, can you speak to some of the particular risks related to agriculture?
I've heard similar stories from people who have worked in some of these food processing facilities. One friend who, local guy in Harrisonburg who has been in and out of prison for years and is living in our neighborhood, got a job at the poultry plant and was ordered by his supervisor to lift a 100-pound bag of some sort of chemicals by himself and threw out his back. And his supervisor told him that he would give him a day off with pay if he wouldn't go to a doctor and see a doctor, that they'll let their own medical people see him, but he did not want him to go report this. He suffered chemical burns on his legs and had a severe back injury, and so it was only given a day. And there's nothing he can do. He has no power in that situation. If he complains, he just gets fired. They'll just find somebody else to take his place. So there's an exchangeability of parts in a system like that, where people as people, as skilled and intelligent, affectionate, emotional beings are not honored and seen as valuable. And can just be exchanged for whoever else needs to come in. And that's one of the predominant things I've heard from people, is just how disempowering that is, because they have no say. There's no decision-making power in this. They're touching food all day and yet are hungry, because they don't get to make any of these decisions and see the results that benefit them in that situation.
Yeah, these are really powerful examples, and they, I think, illustrate well. One that struck me, and this is not from Florida, this is from Shelbyville, from that Tyson plant, was when one of the workers fell into one of the freezing units and was killed over New Year's. Was crushed in the machine. And Tyson, the next day, put out a press release, because it had been in the news, the local paper, that the plant had not been in operation at the time, and he was not a Tyson employee, and that was the length of their press release. Because he was on the cleaning crew, and so they didn't count him. But I think these, instead of going through more stories, I think these illustrate well what kinds of vulnerability people are forced into. I think I want to emphasize that these are changeable. They were designed. There are people in charge of these. There are people in charge of the speed of the line in a chicken slaughterhouse. There are people in charge of determining at what level of occupational injury they're going to make an ergonomics intervention, or how much they're risking by telling people to go back to the line after they've been injured instead of giving them medical care. Those are decisions that are made on a daily basis. Sometimes by people who mean well, sometimes by people who mean badly, but that are structured in. And I think what I want to point out about that is that these jobs have not always been bad. You could make $35 an hour meat packing in parts of the U.S. in 1970. In the 1920s, people would leave the auto plants in Los Angeles during tomato season to go pick tomatoes because the working conditions were better in the tomato fields than in the auto plants. But in the 1930s, those workers who organized in the auto plants and formed what now we know of as the United Auto Workers, challenged the decision-making of that industry and said workers should have some kind of voice in the conditions of our labor. We shouldn't die on the line. We shouldn't have to see people crushed next to us. We shouldn't have to be paid a wage that is half on what you can raise a family on. Those are things that in the 1930s and 40s, the auto workers managed to challenge and improve in a lot of the industry. Likewise in the meat packing industry. And then there's certain situations where work did not improve. Farm work was one of those, where conditions have gotten worse in farm work every year since the 1970s. Wages have gone down each year. There have been more and more exclusions each year. In Tennessee, this is coming under the workers' compensation law that was recently passed, and the even more exclusions that are being proposed now. But I think it's important to recognize that meatpacking has not always been the worst job in the world. It's something that you could work a 6 or 7 hour shift with one income earner for a family of 5 or 10 and make a living wage in much of the country up until a couple of decades ago. Farm work in human history has not always been a job that would destroy your body and prevent you from having a decent livelihood. Those are things that are built in. Those are things that are choices that we have. And so the example that I'll give is one that goes the other direction, which is how that in farm work things have gotten worse year after year for quite a while. And it's worth pointing out that the reason why work got better in some sectors and did not get better in farm work was because there were laws passed to prevent farm workers from being able to have those protections. In the 1930s, they were excluded. Right now, if you are trying to organize for better conditions at a slaughterhouse or at an auto plant or as a dining worker at Lipscomb, and you're fired for it, there's a law that protects you. In farm work, that's not true. You can be fired without any recourse for attempting to point out for attempting to change how they spray in the fields. That you don't want them to spray toxic chemicals on you while you're picking, for example. You can be fired for trying to change that. So those sorts of things. And they were excluded from minimum wage protections, from overtime protections. Legally, right now in Tennessee, you can be paid 50 cents an hour as a farm worker on a small farm, and it's legal. You can be paid 25 cents as a farm worker on a small farm in Tennessee, and that's legal. You can be paid 5 cents an hour, and that's legal. Because the minimum wage law was written in such a way that it explicitly excluded farm workers from child labor protections, from overtime protections, from minimum wage protections. So these are why some jobs are bad, and some jobs workers manage to make them better. And so in Florida, the like positive example that I want to bring up is that workers, even without the protection of having the right to organize without retaliation, even without the right to minimum wage or things like that, have sort of found a way to go around those exclusions and to try to challenge an industry that destroys people's bodies. So you have the arthritis of a 75-year-old by the time you're 39. And have been able to increase wages, have been able to reduce working hours, have been able to make things safer over the last 5 or 10 years through campaigns of their own direction and choosing. And that's possible to do. It's possible to do again in places where it's been turned around, like in meatpacking. And those are choices that how we want to involve ourselves in efforts to do that will make a huge difference in those workers' ability to have someone have their back as they're taking those risks.
Thank you. And Tristan was a perfect segue into what I'm terming our 7th inning stretch. So this is an opportunity to stand up, stretch your legs, and kind of let these ideas sit for a moment, and we will come back and talk about opportunities. And we do not talk about challenges without spending an appropriate amount of time talking about opportunities, leverage points within systems, and leaving on a note of empowerment. So 7th inning stretch, stand up. I need to move. All right, so we are reconvening around our message of hope and our opportunities for making impact by hitting leverage points within systems thinking and sustainability theory. We discuss as points within a system where the smallest impact can have, or the smallest effort can have the greatest impact. So let's talk about what some of those are. Jonathan is doing holistic, kind of long-term restorative work. Tristan has some great examples of farm worker organizing that has been, and some leverage points that Coalition of Immokalee workers have hit on and been very successful with. And Lee, I'd like for you to speak to this as well. So what are some leverage points? What are some impacts that can be made? And who is doing the change? Who is affecting the change? And how are they doing that collaboratively? Because one of our principles in sustainability is that we don't ask, what can I do? We ask, what can we do? So with that, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. Sometimes it takes a little thought because my job is about problem solving. And so identifying problems that need to be worked out is a difficult thing because it can create an atmosphere of negativity in my mind sometimes. And so sometimes it's hard to see those moments of hope and those opportunities. But being a part of this helps me reflect on that a little bit more and realize the places where there are horizons, where sunrises are happening. And one of those places is a new staffing agency. And if you'll indulge me for one moment to explain what a staffing agency is, because I'll be open and honest about it. Coming from the background that I came from, I was not familiar with what a staffing agency is and what it does until I started working in this job 3 years ago. A staffing agency is a temporary agency, and essentially what a staffing agency does is it gets contracts with large companies to supply workers to that company. And when a worker is getting a job through a staffing agency, he or she is not getting a job with the company where he or she is working. They're getting a job with the staffing agency. And so the staffing agency pays them whatever wage that the staffing agency has contracted with the company to pay that person. The company is essentially outsourcing their HR to the staffing agency, so they don't have to pay for the time and material resources to deal with human resources items such as insurance, leave, when somebody quits, stuff like that. All of that costs money. And so big companies save money by outsourcing those things to a staffing agency. And staffing agencies can be a great resource for refugees, especially those who don't have education. Because a lot of times to get hired at, say, Nissan, it depends on what company you're working for at Nissan, whether or not a high school diploma is required. So going through a staffing agency can be a great way for a refugee to enter into a world of new skills, a world that introduces them to some work that they might like to receive education to do at a free technical college, for example. And so a group of Cambodian refugees, who are mostly now citizens because Cambodians were not resettled past like the 90s, a group of Cambodian refugees decided that there was a hole in this culture of staffing agencies where a lot of refugees are going through staffing agencies to get jobs, but this group of Cambodian refugees realized that a lot of times the staffing agencies and the companies aren't really working together to communicate with the refugees, to really actually overcome the cultural unawareness happening between supervisors and employees and things like that. So they also found some other places in the actual process of the different companies that they were working with previously, some holes in the actual production process that were not benefiting the company or the people working for them. So they decided to start a new staffing agency. And the premise of this very, very small, very new staffing agency is that they can help companies reconfigure their processes in order to better accommodate their employees and to actually get better production. Because we all know that when you have happy workers, when you have workers that know they're earning a fair wage, that are being treated fairly, your production is going to go up. That's just the reality of it. And so upon that premise, they started the staffing agency and partnered with a local food processing company that is based in Nashville. It's only in Nashville. It's very small. And they started with this company to help them improve some of their processes. And that company has been very open to their suggestions. And a lot of my clients who are now working there really like it because even though it's a food processing company, it's small, it's local, they get more attention, their supervisors have more patience with them. The staffing agency is really small and works very closely with the managers and supervisors to make sure that the refugees are understanding exactly what they need to be doing, exactly where they're making mistakes, exactly where the company is making mistakes. So communication is a lot easier when you have a smaller group of people trying to figure these things out. And so this group of former Cambodian refugees is taking advantage of this hole and saying, hey, this is a point where we can educate people on how to better care for the refugees that are coming now. So that's an excellent thing that's happening.
It's a great example. So it's refugee become citizen owned and organized.
Mm-hmm.
Is this a nonprofit? Is this just a normal or for-profit, I guess, small business that began?
It's a small business.
So it's a small business that emerged from refugees identifying a need in Nashville for a local solution.
Yes.
That if you're in my class and you're doing those your framework of social, environmental, and economic overlap, this hits on a lot of our principles of sustainability. Great example. Thank you. Tristan and John, how are you involved in work, or how have you noticed work that has been successful, hitting some high impact leverage points?
Can I add a couple thoughts about staffing agencies?
Please, talk to each other.
This is really interesting. And I think it's worth adding a couple of sort of steps out to this is a great description of what staffing agencies do and what they're for. And it sort of like leaves the question open, maybe, why do staffing agencies exist? Like, why is this even a thing? And I think it's important. This is related to something we were saying earlier about how much of the system, at some point in its development, has been designed by someone as a profit-saving measure, as a particular way of organizing production that they think will add profits to the company, right? Staffing agencies exist primarily so that the companies that benefit from that work can avoid responsibility for the workers that they're putting to work. This is their origin. In some ways, it's interesting in some ways in this conversation because the origins of the staffing agency in a lot of ways come from rural labor. And a lot of how they've expanded in the South have come from the farm labor contractor system, where often you have, in the literature they call this co-ethnic network recruiting. But basically what we're talking about is someone who maybe in the case of farm work, has maybe been a tomato picker for a number of years, maybe has gained the trust or familiarity with some of the farmers, and then says, give me the contract, I'll bring 40 guys to come pick the field next week. That person has just become, a one-person staffing agency. They've become a recruiter, a labor broker. And the companies, so sometimes they set these up themselves. We call those fake staffing agencies, or phantom staffing agencies, or ghost staffing agencies. And sometimes it's sort of a legitimate separate business that brokers, but Nissan does this in Smyrna. I think most of their workers come in through staffing agencies. A lot of the hotels in Nashville do this. A lot of the universities in Nashville use staffing agencies. And primarily, they exist in order to drop the wages of workers. So like, for example, at Vanderbilt, where workers had a living wage campaign a number of years ago that probably some people heard about. It was a starting wage at Vanderbilt of 10 or 11 an hour. And that took years of organizing on what Vanderbilt workers call the Vanderbilt plantation. It took years of organizing to achieve that. This last year, Vanderbilt started what they call outsourcing, meaning they started bringing in workers through a staffing agency and paying them minimum wage instead. staffing agencies have many uses, but in all cases, it's some way for the employer to avoid taking responsibility for the conditions of their workers. It's really interesting when workers start to say, well, let's see if we can get in on that in some way and start making our own decisions and start intervening in it in some way. So that's a really interesting thing to see. I'll give one example that is coming out of the Immokalee Workers campaign that I think is helpful, that they've taught us here. So like I mentioned, in South Florida, so we're talking, I guess I didn't say, we're talking about 100,000 farm workers in Florida, 30,000 of whom are working in Southwest Florida around this town of Immokalee. And it's seasonal work. It's done primarily through things like staffing agencies, through farm labor contractors, as they call it. And so there's layers and layers and layers and layers and layers of denial of responsibility. A farm worker may be working for a subcontractor who's working for a harvest company, who's working for a staffing agency, who's working for a grower, who then has a contract with an aggregator that actually is controlling the terms of that contract. And then they're selling to a packer who then gets their instructions all along this way of what kind of tomatoes to be grown, under what conditions, and what volume from an end buyer. So you can have 8, maybe even 10 layers of up to the top where the decisions actually get made in most of the industry. So Tyson, for example, is a great example. If you go through the chicken supply chain, Tyson at the very top calls the shots on what kind of chicken is going to get grown by somebody that has 100 or 200 birds. Not that they grow in small flocks very often, but so what the Immokalee workers have done is they've said, we've gone up against our crew leaders before. Sometimes they're, one of us. Sometimes they're really nasty people who are put there, particularly because they'll brutally enforce the rules. But one way or the other, they're not the one that calls the shots. Sometimes, and they've gone on strike against the farmers in cases where, in 1995, for example, when they said, we're going to pay you 40 cents a bucket instead of 50, which imagine when you're making an average of $9,000 a year, what that means to you and your family. They said, well, 5,000 of us are going to go on strike and we're going to refuse to work until it goes back up to 50 cents. And they succeeded, but they didn't succeed in getting it any higher. And they ended up saying, we're going to go and we're going to design a campaign at which we hold responsible those corporations that are profiting and that are actually calling the shots of how our daily lives work. And in their case, they went up and chose a corporation which happened to be the largest fast food corporation in the world, which is Yum Brands, based in Louisville, Kentucky. And they specifically chose Taco Bell, which is their growing brand at that time. This is in 2001. Since that campaign took 5 years, it took a nationwide boycott endorsed by the Methodist Church and by the Presbyterian Church and by hundreds of other allied groups around the country that came through here to Nashville in 2002 and 2003, were hosted by churches here in Nashville on what they called truth tours. To build alliances, to find consumers that would support their campaign. They went through places like Notre Dame in Indiana, where students had a 40-day hunger strike until the administration agreed to cut the contract with Taco Bell on Notre Dame campus. And they did that on 50 different university and high school campuses, cutting contracts, until finally in 2005, Taco Bell said, we're okay, we'll sign it. And there's the first major corporation to sit down at the table with Florida farm workers in decades and say, okay, what do you want? And they were very modest requests. These weren't things that turn around our entire food system, but they were changes in our food system that were made from the bottom up by those with their hands on the machines and their hands on the plants. And so they knew what those changes would mean in their daily lives. And so what they got was, a contract for a penny a pound, like I mentioned, this code of conduct and a seat at the table. That has grown, I won't give you all the blow-by-blows, but it's grown to 15 corporations that have signed on after campaigns of that kind. Now we're in 2015, and that program is being implemented statewide for 100,000 workers across Florida. This summer, for the first time, that campaign expanded to 5 states, not including Tennessee, but Florida, South and North Carolina, Georgia, Virginia, and New Jersey. Right now, where that campaign stands is that there's maybe 150,000 workers that are covered under those new protections. but there's major buyers and major corporations that are intentionally floating the market for those farms that are refusing to implement it. The big one here in Nashville that we're talking about is Publix Supermarkets, which is the largest corporation in the state of Florida, which is headquartered 80 miles from Immokalee, right in the backyard of the tomato industry, and which the tomato workers have been asking to meet with them for about 6 years now. And so what we've been doing in Nashville is building support in a place where Publix cares what we think, because anybody that grew up in Nashville, Publix wasn't here 20 years ago, right? They've built 31 Publixes in Middle Tennessee in the last 12 years. They want to build 30 more in the next 10 years. And so this is the campaign, sort of a proven program that's being implemented that has made tremendous changes for farm workers in 5 states now. Last year I would have been able to say 1 state, now I get to say 5, which is exciting to say. But that will fall apart if we do not continue to bring it to the rest of the industry. And so that's one of the things I'm really excited to be able to invite people into here in Nashville, to be able to take those concerns and to really bring those changes with our support from Nashville as consumers that those corporations care about and will listen to.
Thank you, Tristan.
Yeah. I'll just say, for people that are interested in getting involved in that, is it okay if I pass around the
Please.
sign-up sheet?
Sure.
Okay. If you want to be involved in that campaign, we can talk later. Here's the thing you can sign up.
Yeah.
Maybe send it.
So Tristan's talking about a grassroots campaign that started with workers in one town, in one industry, and has grown to a national movement over time, but through the efforts of lots of people and interaction with businesses we all know and name, like Taco Bell, Publix, etc. So, Jonathan, can you describe what this looks like on a small scale, but maybe a more deep-rooted approach and a long-term land restoration and human restoration, relationship restoration approach that you're taking?
I would love to be able to talk about that. Need a few more years. It is really important to talk about hopes and opportunities and possibilities, but it's also, I think, important for me as a discipline to, at times, not rush too quickly, because I think people like me who have a lot of power and privilege through generations of systemic oppression want to find the quick, easy, like, well, what are we going to do now? How are we going to fix this? And sometimes I need to just sit and live with the fact that I'm complicit in these systems, that I have a part in this. And maybe I don't have the answers and I need to listen more. And the irony of sitting up here saying I need to listen more. But that's where I have seen the most possibility, is listening to the people who have been the most directly impacted by these systems, who know what it's like to live these realities and who are dreaming alternatives and imagining things that I can't even think of. Real quickly, I'll just note that in Ta-Nehisi Coates' new book, Between the World and Me, it's written as a letter to his 15-year-old son about what it means to be black in America, where so many people, this new group of people who think that they're white, are pursuing relentlessly this dream that demands that crushes people's bodies and breaks people's bones. And he says, don't put your hope in those people. In fact, Coates doesn't have that much room for hope. He tells his son the struggle is what it's about. It's about the struggle. And who are those people, who are those groups that are struggling, that are doing this, who have been doing this, that I have to think about doing it, and those people who just react by instinct to struggle because that's the reality. I have friends and neighbors like that who are teaching me incredible things. A Congolese refugee family who's been in the States now for 12 years or so, family of 5 or 6 boys. Father has to work 2.5 hours away so that they have money, but all they want to do is farm. All they wanted to do is care for the land, because that's what their ancestors did. And during the Civil War, they were forced out and came to the United States and haven't had that opportunity. They don't have the money or the resources to get access to land. And so they approached us and said, can you help us figure this out? We see what you're doing here on this piece of land that was a degraded parking lot and urban fill and several abandoned foreclosed former crack houses, and now through years of building the soil and planting trees and planting cover crops and forming small, think about system optimization, forming small ditches so that the rainwater coming off of the road, we can move slowly through the system, because we have all these impervious surfaces that water is rushing so quickly across. It doesn't have time to seep into soil and recharge underground aquifers. And our money system, our economy is the same way. Money moves way too quickly and can't recharge local economies. Our information system is the same way. Our fast iPhones and iPads and computers means that information never becomes knowledge, never becomes wisdom, because it doesn't have time to seep in. So how do we create things that slow things down and seep them into the soil, into our communities? And so this family wanted some way to be able to do this. And so I was designing a neighborhood orchard at the Salvation Army, which is down the block from us, and just giving us land to use because they weren't using it, which is a huge system optimization, I'll say right now, an opportunity. Churches and schools and local associations that have massive amounts of land that they're just mowing. Like, think about the amount of food that we could grow here. Churches with kitchens that can be certified, that have classrooms, that have offices. Like, are you kidding me? What an amazing amount of wealth that's being wasted right now, that's not being used. There's over 35 million acres of lawn in this country that's just being mowed. That's a ton of food potential right there. So this family was looking for that, and they saw Salvation Army and said, can we put a garden right next to your orchard there? So now they have a huge garden that they've been cultivating for the past year, and we've now connected them to Eastern Mennonite University, and they're using a lot of their campus gardens as well, growing a bunch of food for their family, so sustaining their family. They're growing a bunch of food for market. They want to start a food truck. And there's a large Congolese population in Harrisonburg, and so they're starting food justice organizations and associations with their neighbors. We have nothing to do with it because we don't know what we're doing. They do. And we just connected them to Salvation Army, and they went off from there. We have tons to learn from people like that who are learning what it means to live well in this place after being displaced. What does it mean now to take care of this piece of land and our neighbors that we didn't choose, that we're here now? And that is one of the most exciting possibilities that I see on that small level.
Thank you. What kind of food is culturally appropriate or endemic to the Congo? What are they growing that we may not have heard of before or eaten?
That we haven't heard of. Unfortunately, I don't remember all those names, but they have okra and sweet potatoes and types of amaranth, which is a grain, and the leaves are also edible and highly nutritious. And ecological thinking and ecological systems, nothing ever just does one thing. Everything's doing multiple things. It's the principle of multiple functionality. And so amaranth is a food. Amaranth is a cover crop, so it builds the soil because of the way its roots relate to microorganisms. It has thousands of little flowers that attract beneficial insects, parasitic wasps that then feed on the pest of other vegetables. So just by being itself, by doing one thing, it's doing all these other things, which is a far cry from multitasking, which is what a lot of us do, which is trying to do multiple unrelated things at one time, and it just causes a lot of stress. Ecological systems have figured this out. A tree, just by being a tree, is doing hundreds of different things at once. And so how do we design our agricultural and social systems to be like a tree and not like multitaskers?
Thank you. Along those lines, what I'm hearing you say is that biological diversity is always a strength. Cultural diversity in a cultivated, collaborative experience is also a strength. And the immigrant population that is a great part of our food system brings a high level of diversity of ideas and of opportunities and the possibilities and the complexity. The complexity arises, but so do, and with complexity comes management challenges. But always come robustness, bounty, resiliency, stability.
Yeah, ecologically, diversity is health. And this is kind of a couple of things have to be remembered is while this diversity of our neighbors is amazing, what produced that diversity was economic and cultural imperialism and the displacement of local communities from around the world. And so while we have this amazing opportunity to learn from our friends, what are the forces that cause that? As we think about immigrants in the food system, I'm an immigrant in the food system. I'm not indigenous here. I'm an immigrant to this food system as well and have been in charge of it for too long and exploiting it. And so, but certain neighbors of ours from Guatemala and from Mexico, we were harvesting a bunch of beans and sitting there kind of shelling them out. And they said, this is crazy. Back home, what we do is we put it all in a blanket and you wrap it up and you take a stick and you beat it. And it was incredibly effective. They knew what they were doing. And we were taking hours and they got it done in 20 minutes because they had the cultural memory and the knowledge directly from their own experiences and had just been passed down through the stories of their ancestors that they were then sharing with us. And we were learning from them in pretty profound ways.
That's fantastic. Thank you. So we're bumping up against our time limit tonight. I hope the conversation does not stop. I encourage you to interact with your neighbors and your new friends and our presenters as well. Anything that, any points that everybody on the panel would like to leave with? I'll leave with that that diversity is always health. Echoing Jonathan.
I want to leave with two things, I think. One, I want to specifically, there's a lot of people in this room that are doing really good work, and I want to specifically say, at least from Nashville Fair Food, we have a really strong organizational relationship with Workers' Dignity, which is a really tremendous organization in Nashville that's doing the kind of organizing that I described it, the Immokalee workers doing with this sort of worker-led movement to transform their own conditions. If I can recognize, if you could raise your hand, Brenda. Brenda's here from Workers' Dignity, and organizing in the food sector right now, and in the hospitality sector in Nashville, where the kind of conditions that we're talking about happening at Tyson, the kind of conditions we're talking about happening in the farms are also happening in office cleaning and in hotel cleaning, and there is a solution to that, right? And there are people currently organizing in the city who must be supported in order for those things to change. And the one other thing that I wanted to say that I think it can be hopeful, maybe, is just to say, we framed the overall conversation around immigrants in the food system. And because I'm coming with my Nashville Fair Food hat on right now, I want to say something that I've heard the Immokalee workers say every time that's been brought up. Because, I mean, sort of the thing that a lot of people notice, especially if you ever go to the fields, is that a lot of the people in the fields weren't born in the United States. A lot were, but a lot are coming from Mexico and Haiti and Guatemala and other places. And every time I've heard it brought up, I think, the Immokalee workers say, to frame this, the conditions that we're talking about happening in the food system, on the one hand, have everything to do with migration. On the other hand, are absolutely not about migration. Yeah, and I think you put it really well in saying that the tremendous diversity that we then get to benefit from and get to experience and is really exciting and resilient is a result of people's experiences of expulsion from the places where they're coming from. Sometimes also, for adventure or fun, or people move around for a variety of reasons. But largely, the massive migrations that we're seeing are preventable, and they have specific origins. And what the Immokalee workers say, whenever that's brought up, is they say, y'all didn't treat farm workers well 100 years ago in Florida either. And it wasn't people speaking Spanish in the fields in Florida. In the 1840s, as Florida is being colonized by the plantation system, it's not by undocumented migrants, for example, right? It fundamentally is about how a society treats the people that do its most necessary tasks. And in a sense, that has everything to do with migration, because one of the ways that people and corporations seek profit is by ripping people away from their families and by disconnecting people from the lands that they grew up in or from the homes where they can sustain themselves. And in that sense, it has everything to do with migration, but not necessarily in the way that we sometimes think of it as that people are treated particularly because they're migrants, but rather that migration is one of the ways that the employers seek ways of making profit. And that's something I think we need to sit with, and I've tried to sit with in hearing that response from the farm workers, who most of the people saying this are themselves immigrants, and so I think it carries a weight with me to hear them say it.
I'd like to leave with saying that things are a lot more complicated than what we want them to be. I don't know how many of you have studied the Myers-Briggs personality thing, but I'm a very strong J. So I want things to be, my natural instinct is to want things to be black and white. I want things to be this way or this way. And I'm going to take a hard line this way or this way. And one thing that I've learned in my work, starting out as a young adult volunteer in Ghana for a year, going from that to working in an inner city youth program, going from that to divinity school, and from that privileged environment back to working with people, the salt of the earth kind of people again, with refugees, is that if I take a hardline opinion one way, a day later I'm going to learn that that's no longer valid, or at least it's not completely valid. For example, today I came prepared to talk about my opinions about Tyson for a large part, and I did. I told you what I think about Tyson. But on the flip side of that, when I was having a conversation with my assistant today, who was talking about her husband working there, I asked her what he likes and what he doesn't like, and those are the only two questions that I asked her. And she came up with a longer list of what he liked about it than what he didn't like about it. And that's not what I wanted to hear, because I honestly do not believe that Tyson is doing the right thing. I honestly don't believe that it's right for refugees to be dumped off at the door and locked into that employment. I honestly don't believe that people are being treated fairly there. But she honestly believes that it's benefiting her family for her husband to work there. And until she believes otherwise, she may not believe otherwise at any point, then who am I to say that needs to change right now? I believe that it needs to change, but until her community as a whole makes that decision, I can't impose that decision upon them. And so I can give my piece, I can give my information, I can tell her and others the ways in which I believe Tyson is locking people into a system that does not benefit them in the long run, that it is not sustainable. But until they are ready to hear that, or until they are integrated enough into the fabric of American society to draw those conclusions on their own, I don't believe that it is right for me to impose that upon them. I can give them information, but I can't tell them what to think, because they're just as human and just as emotional and just as visceral as I am, if not more, considering the place of poverty that they're coming from, the place of desperation that they're coming from. And I don't know that place of desperation, so I can't make that decision for them. And so I would like to leave you with how complicated things are.
Well, let's give a round of applause and thank him for that question. I invite you all back for the November iteration of Collaborative Conversation. The conversation continues in November. Thank you so much for coming. Good night.